have started recording. I hope so. Okay. Hello and welcome to our very first webinar of the academic year featuring Joseph Eisman, who has also contributed to the growth of our SIG incredibly for many years. My name is Hande Fenerci, and I'm a doctoral student at Virginia Tech and the co-senior graduate student representative for the complexity theories in education SIG. The purpose of the SIG is to apply, advance, and extend complexity theories to inquiry, research, theory, and practice in a variety of educational contexts. And in the meantime, hold on, please. I will start accepting participants. Yep. Joey is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education and an adjunct assistant professor at the College of Education and Human Development at Temple University. His research explores the relationships between empathy, emotion, motivation, identity, and creativity in educational contexts using complex dynamic systems theories. Joey received his Ph.D. at Temple University, and he holds an MA from Teachers College, Columbia University, and BS from the University of Michigan. Joey will deliver his presentation with an opportunity for a question and answer session. Please join me in welcoming Joey.
It's funny now to be on the other side where I'm not presenting. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for welcoming me back into the SIG in this way. It's funny to think about the language that's being used from explorer to experts, and I definitely want to highlight I'm very much on the explorer side of that language, of that identity. I'm going to share my screen. Can you just let me know if you can see my screen? Wonderful, thank you. So I'm very excited to be here with all of you presenting this research and to kind of kick off the work that both the co-chairs, Hande, Ali, and Yasmin have been working on, and to kind of give you a glimpse into some of the work that I've been working on recently, especially in relation to my dissertation work. This actually, what I'm presenting is a portion of the dissertation study, and which proposed a novel approach to conceptualizing, but also measuring empathy. That work, I want to just acknowledge Avi, who's on the call, is my advisor, and that never goes away. I'm always going to have the identity. So a lot of this work has been inspired by and informed by a lot of his ideas, and also Dr. Joanna Gardner, who's also a member of the SIG. And a lot of the ideas that I'm going to try and talk about is really empathy in education. Generally, empathy is really associated with many positive outcomes. It enhances teacher and student relationships. We know that can improve student academic outcomes, teaching quality, and a lot more. But as you're going to come to see, or hopefully I'll do my best to present this important construct, which is often touted in things like education policy, and administrators encourage their teachers to be more empathetic, we don't really describe it well. We don't really describe or measure the authentic empathetic experience. So this led me to suggest a reconceptualization of empathy through a complex dynamic systems lens. The talk today, I'll briefly introduce empathy constructs and measures, then highlight the value of complex dynamic systems as the guiding approach, then introduce a theoretical framework that had guided the entire conceptualization of empathy. That, of course, is the DSMRI, the Dynamic Systems Model of Raw Identity. And finally, I'm going to describe an application of this approach, which constituted a portion of my dissertation study. So really, we know that there's many ways to describe empathy. And recognizing these many definitions and constructs, which you can see here on the screen, we have this, these are all subsumed under the umbrella of this thing that we call empathy. And there's many different ways that we can splice and dice this term. But we also know that oftentimes these measures, these constructs, align with similar phenomenological experiences, which can cause jangle fallacies. And for example, you can see that there are two major overlapping phenomenological experiences that often are the focus of empathy literature. There's the inferring what another person thinks or feels. We often refer to that as the cognitive forms of empathy. And then there's the feeling what another person feels, which is often referred to as the affective forms of empathy. And it's important to acknowledge that there are other major forms, but these are the two that have really guided most of the contemporary research. In fact, when we look at the measures of empathy, we often see that they're also looking to measure latent constructs like cognitive empathy and affective empathy. And here's an example of one of the more common survey materials that is used for the past 40 plus years. And you can see that it's looking at cognitive empathy, affective empathy as latent constructs. There are subscales. There's example items you can see here. And these are from the interpersonal reactivity index, which really has been king in the empathy survey world. But these are just one way to look at empathy. Another major way also survey is pictorially. We see a lot of different surveys looking using imagery or metaphor to try and interrogate someone's empathic experience. So here we have what's called the inclusion of the other and self, where it's highlighting a very specific form of cognitive empathy that's called self-other overlap. And visually, that's really just how much do you feel interconnected or similar to another person. So you could be closer to letter A. In this example, it's about yourself and a homeless person, very far apart. Or maybe you're G, where you share a lot of overlap. And that signifies one of the ways we might try and capture this thing that we call empathy. But as we come to see, truth is that even though we know we aim to capture these major phenomena, really we're just capturing one of these components. And therefore, we can never wholly capture the authentic empathy experience, which we know is dynamic, complex, and I think really important to this research is situated in a role. Let me give you some examples of what I mean by that. So here are three different roles that someone might have: a teacher, a parent, or a physician. And for example, we can anticipate that the way that a teacher empathizes with their students is different from the way that another person, let's say a parent, empathizes with their children. And those two different forms of empathy look different and are associated with different actions and beliefs and goals and self-perceptions, different emotional experiences. And what is expected in one is not expected in another. Similarly, when we think about something like physician empathy, which has a long definition, or excuse me, has a very stable definition in the physician empathy literature, is often is where is where medical students are encouraged to take on more of the cognitive forms of empathy over the affective, or to say it differently, physicians are taught to really try and understand their patients but not to really feel what their patients are feeling, which does make some sense because we know that affective empathy is often associated with worse prognoses, diagnoses, and treatment plans. So creating some of this distancing can be helpful. So here we can actually identify that empathy is shifting within inside of a role. So when we look at capturing empathy, we have to be specific to its and acknowledge it is context sensitive, it is dynamic, and it does shift moment to moment. But this is a challenge because normally when we look at the major ways in which we capture empathy, we look at it through traditional component dominant systems. Let's think back to the interpersonal activity index. That was that survey I first introduced with cognitive empathy and affective empathy. And in this example, we understand that there are latent variables and manifest variables, and that they have these linear directionality behind them, and that we're looking at how do these things interact. But the truth is, to really interrogate them appropriately, we can't use this component dominant system. We have to use an interaction dominant system, which is what you see here on the right. So let's go through why we're talking about complexity and why I think this is useful. So we know, as many of us who are familiar with complexity, that these approaches are flexible and adaptable, and that they're able to capture more of the complex social phenomenon like empathy, and which allows us to see things from a non-linear perspective, going back to that previous component dominant system, this approach. So this also makes sense because empathy is not linear. It is nonlinear, actually. And what that means is that a change to a system may result in unproportional outcome. So we know actually that empathy has nonlinear consequences. As an example, in a recent paper by Alder et al., they suggested that, and I'll quote them, both low and extremely high levels of teacher empathy might be problematic, potentially causing a nonlinear relationship with the quality of teacher-student interactions and student outcomes. Or to say it differently, teacher empathy is not always going up or down. Low levels of teacher empathy or high levels of teacher empathy may actually be just as negative to the student-teacher relationship. High levels of teacher empathy may be just as impactful negatively to the teacher-student relationship as would a low level. So this is, of course, nonlinear in that way. And when we look at this nonlinearity, we're also acknowledging the interaction between these components. These are metaphorically in this example here, these are like the little dots. So they're dynamic, and that means that they are interacting over time and that they're interdependent, which acknowledges that components of the system are assumed to be interconnected and therefore they influence each other. So when we're looking at all these components, we're then looking what's the macro level emergence, or to say it differently, we're looking to see what is the appearance of a complex behavior that develops from these interacting dynamic components in the system. And that when we look at what we look at this higher level is not is irreducible, which is to say this system is nested and is more than the sum of its parts. And this is really important because what I'm trying to highlight here is that traditional empathy literature has focused on this linear approach, which is focused on simple components, is often neglecting certain constructs over others, and we're missing the whole picture. And this is not useful if we really care about the entire authentic experience of what we call empathy. Acknowledging the complexity, the dynamics, and the role situatedness of the empathic experience, I'm encouraging us to then shift our focus and then use a different approach. This is a complex dynamic systems approach, one that is grounded in the dynamic systems model of role identity, the DSMRI. And here's a schematic representation of the DSMRI. The DSMRI, for those who are not familiar, is grounded in complex dynamic systems ontologies and is a meta-theoretical framework that conceptualizes action as emergent from a person's socioculturally constructed and context-dependent role identity. That's the idiosyncratic way of taking up a role. And for our example, and most of the people on this call, it's really that of a teacher. Like, what is the teacher's role or the role identity or the teacher role? And this framework really stands in contrast to those traditional approaches I showed you earlier and can highlight the way that we can integrate the many different constructs of empathy into one single framework. This is really impactful because we can then start to highlight how the DSMRI can capture the entirety of the authentic experience. Let me show you how and what I mean by that. So we start to focus on the contents or the four role-related factors that are interdependent. And these four related factors, what we call the content, are someone's ontological beliefs or epistemological beliefs. Those are referring to knowledge, beliefs, and assumptions that they have about the world. Or the level of certainty about those, their credibility, which is the epistemological. Purposes and goals are a person's purpose or their for action or their goals, objectives in reference in their role. Self-perceptions or self-definitions are self-references in relation to a role, things like self-efficacy, perceived values, interests, abilities, etc. And finally, we have perceived action possibilities, which are internal and external behavior in relation to a role. So let's put this now in the language of the DSMRI with empathy. So we know that a person can have an ontological belief that is empathetic, that they may have a belief about emotional experience. Or a teacher can have a goal to be more empathetic. They can consider action possibilities that are viewed as more empathetic, for example, trying to take someone's perspective, that traditional getting in someone's shoes. And finally, a person can have a self-perception that they themselves are empathetic. Now, we also not only are interested in these different components of the DSMRI, the contents, but also the structures. And these are a reference to the relationships between the contents, often referring to tension or alignment between and within contents. And the DSM-I uniquely can capture the emergence of these empathic informed actions and affective experiences at this level as well. So not only are we asking, well, is that empathetic goal present, but maybe does empathy emerge when there's alignment between a goal and a belief, or does it not emerge when there's tension between an action possibility and a self-perception, for example? And you'll see me, by the way, use these lines, or it's going to be double-headed arrows again. You're going to see me use them in green in reference to alignment, or red when it's in tension. And finally, with the DSM-I, we also have the processes, which is reference to changes in the content of the structures that I just mentioned. But all of this, of course, is being framed inside of a person's control parameters. And these are also empathetic in content or in perception. So, for example, a person's context might determine the type of empathy that they may show. The domain might also inform them. For example, in the teacher empathy world, we might suggest that the type of empathy that a math teacher has versus a social studies teacher might change. The culturally mediated means and what is normally empathetic might also be might shift. And finally, the person's own personal dispositions and what is their own dispositional levels of empathy as well. So this is my call to suggest that the DSM-I can function well for capturing the entire authentic empathy experience by integrating all these different components simultaneously. To show this, I'm going to show you an example. This is just a taste of some of the work that came out of my dissertation. And I'm going to show you an example that was really highlighting how you can use the DSM-I to unpack, but more importantly, to show the entirety of empathy emerging from someone's goals, beliefs, perceived action possibilities, and self-perceptions. So in this example, I'm going to show you data. The data for here is only going to be two pieces of data. It is a life story and narrative inquiry interview, which is where I asked the teacher to reflect upon emotional experiences while teaching or tell me about how they became a teacher. And then also a video stimulated recall interview where the teacher in the study explicated their actions and decisions during a recorded video segment of their class. The two teachers in this study were purposely sampled and both taught the same school. I'm going to introduce you to Kevin and Kelly, who taught at Windsor Tech. Windsor Tech is a vocational school in the Mid-Atlantic United States that primarily serves students from marginalized identities. And Kevin identifies as white and male and is a veteran English language arts teacher who's been teaching in that school for a long time. By contrast, we have Kelly. Kelly is a multiracial female who is both a science teacher at the school and also fulfills the role as the athletic director. And we're going to focus on their experiences. And to really highlight their story, I'm going to introduce you to a very specific form of empathy that comes out of the work of Dr. Hunter Gelbach from Gelbach MU in 2023, where they were looking at social perspective taking, which I will argue is a form of empathy where you are trying to understand someone's experiences. And there's two different ways that a person can engage in social perspective taking according to their paper. One is that of a judge. And the judge makes assumptions. You are judging someone about existing knowledge, which does have an available heuristic. If you want to make quick assumptions about people in value of keeping resources, time, etc. And then we have a detective. The detective seeks out information and is a more costly job, but is perceived by many as being maybe a little more adaptive because you are then learning what is actually true. And operationalizing these two with inside the DSM-I, we have the detective is part of the action possibilities. So seeking information, I'm going to generally refer to as an action possibility. And the judge is generally as an ontological belief because there's assumptions being made and their belief systems and they are then believing things about their students. So let me first start with Kevin. Kevin is our judge. And his empathetic, judging ontological beliefs, we saw alignment across his identity system. So, as an example, and you're going to see me use color here. So, the color in the quote will match the color that you're going to see in the DSMRI schematic. So, for example, that whole quote is blue, which is the ontological belief. And then once again, the green double arrows are alignments, just to kind of keep everyone on the same track. So he said the students at Windsor Tech, his school, come from all over the city, but many from the Windsor Tech neighborhood, many from difficult circumstances. Many of the students face tremendous hardships, and most have experienced a wide range of traumas. This is an ontological belief that Kevin has told us, and from the interview, he has made clear this is something that he believes, but doesn't always have the knowledge to back that up. He doesn't actually seek out information from his students. He's making many assumptions about them. But we see here that his judging, his empathetic judging, carries through and shows alignment with inside of his identity system on the whole. So, as another example, here he talks about where he lowers his standards to help his students feel better. And this is a direct response to his beliefs about his students having hardships in their life. So, for example, as an action possibility, he says, if providing a smack of success by giving good grades moves the needle just a tiny bit with their own self-image, with their own who they are, with their own way they feel about themselves, he then says, as a self-perception and as a goal, I'm 1,000,000% down. So we can see here that Kevin is highlighting how his beliefs about his students has led to new action possibilities and new what is perceived as empathetic actions, beliefs, goals, and self-perceptions that are in favor of making students feel better. So he's using this knowledge to inform everything else. This is not what's going on with Kelly. Kelly's quite the opposite. While Kevin is comfortable making these assumptions, Kelly does not have that same comfort. And while I don't have it here, I can tell you that this comes from her own experiences where she made assumptions about students in the past, and as a process changed her actions and started to become a detective. That is, once again, where she seeks out information. So we can see here as an action possibility and a goal, she says explicitly in reference to seeking out information, she says, in terms of that for parents, I was like, hey, is there anything I should know that will help me become a better teacher for your child? And then we can see here that in response to that, she has this ontological belief about what her parents tell her, or excuse me, what the parents tell her. They say, and sometimes they do open up. A lot of times it's like, I've had things like, oh, please know that my son or my child really likes to move around. So once again, she's using her detective action possibilities, which is an empathetic experience, is an empathetic action possibility, align with the goal, and align with this new belief, excuse me. And then we also see her explicitly talk about how this is part of both a goal and then also a perceived action we also see this once again as now an action possibility and a self-perception. So she says, I try to let them know, i.e., her students, if I do not know your circumstance, I cannot afford you the extra grace. Let's compare now for a moment. Kevin said, I'm going to make assumptions and then give my students grace. Kelly is now telling us, I will give my students that grace when I learn something about them to afford them that grace. And that is a different form of empathy where she's still learning about information. She's still creating mental models, learning about them, and showing empathy, but only when it becomes appropriate based on what she now knows. So when we look at their data together, we can see that Kevin is our judge and Kelly is our detective. Now, with the time I have remaining, I'm going to try and show you the way that we then conceptualize this work using state-space landscapes. And I once again want to thank Avi for your help in helping me get through this. So the first part was we found a set of themes across our data. The major themes were self-perceived familiarity, responsive action possibility, flexibility, goal, and action possibility. So specifically, self-perceived familiarity refers to familiarity with students' lived experiences, cultural knowledge, ethno-racial views, and personal lives. How familiar am I with my students? Responsiveness as an action possibility indicates the warmth or adaptability to the student's needs. Um, and then finally, flexibility refers to how accommodating am I to my students? So low flexibility would be I really hold my students accountable to do things, or high flexibility would be I really give my students grace. So to demonstrate these three emergent themes, we then looked at them and interpret them as dimensions across state-space landscapes. So I'm going to walk through these three, or excuse me, how I interpret or how I read these together. I'm going to show the flexibility one, which once again refers to um, how flexible were you? Were you more accommodating, or were you more holding students accountable? So state-space landscapes, for those who are not familiar, are a visualization that we can use to conceptualize our qualitative data. And they're conceptual models that are often used in complex dynamic systems approaches that describe all possible states, patterns of a system. So in it, we look for things like, conceptually, we look for things like hills. So hills represent unstable repeller states, so instability, while a valley refers to, a valley requires energy to move out of, and is often it refers to an attractor state. So if we see a valley, it's harder to move out of a valley. So think kind of like conceptually, I'll show you here with the ball. Imagine the ball is representative of a person. You have flexibility, are they low, medium, or high, which you can see in the bottom there. And then you have energy. So if a person is in a state where they are on a high hill, this we refer to once again as a repeller state, and it takes very little energy, think back to physics, to move from there. So we're thinking kinetic and potential energy. So this is unstable state, and the ball wants to move somewhere. And if it moves down this way, it moves into a valley or an attractor state. And it's much harder to move out of an attractor state once you're in an attractor state. So it takes more energy to move out. To now demonstrate how we then looked at this, once again, as a reminder, we're looking at flexibility, responsiveness, and then familiarity. Familiarity does not exist in XY axis. Familiarity you're going to see actually as a color scheme. So pink is low familiarity with students' lived experiences, and high familiarity is blue. And of course, the y-axis is energy. So how easy is it to move conceptually out of this space? So Kevin once again was our judge. He felt comfortable making assumptions about students. And when we look at his identity landscape, it's clear that with this alignment in his identity landscape, he had a very comfortable, stable identity system. We can see here that he had high responsiveness to his students, really high flexibility because he was willing to give them grace no matter what. But even though he had low familiarity, he did not know their circumstances. He was making assumptions about them. From his stable identity system and alignment across identity system, he was going to be stable. Now, that's not true. It's not true for Kelly. Kelly conceptually, when she does not know something about a student, she seeks it out. Once again, she's our detective. So as an example here, we have Kelly when she conceptually is in misalignment here, or having tension across her role identity system. We can see that she is now in a repeller state. That's that hill there. And she has low familiarity with her students' lived experiences. But when she seeks them out, we can see that she has identity alignment across her identity system. And she now, inside the high familiarity, is in a more stable identity space. And if you look carefully, you can see on the flexibility at the bottom, she moving from like a low medium to high medium, which is to say, unlike Kevin, who's willing to give the grace, Kelly is not as willing to give the grace unless she now knows something about her students and has sought out information that she then uses to be more empathetic in the way that made sense to her. That's all to say, I believe the DSM-RI as a complex dynamic systems approach and framework is an appropriate and proper way to capture the entire authentic empathetic experience. It embeds all the different constructs I mentioned earlier, which oftentimes traditional approaches will neglect or prioritize one over many. Instead, here we can integrate all of the many into a single framework, look at them as a set of goals, actions, uh, self-perceptions, and beliefs. And by doing so, we can more appropriately and effectively capture the entire whole empathetic experience. And as I end, I just want to say that as someone who's been looking at complexity for a while and has only since really feels like I've found my space in it, I just want to highlight that the people who brought me to systems theories first, we have a forthcoming book coming out on the topic of relationships of power and systems theories in creativity research, with a focus on Gregory Bateson, both as a case study on his life and also his work. And for many of us who are familiar with cybernetics research and Gregory Bateson, there's a strong tie to our work and his. And with that, I want to say thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you for this rich presentation, Joey.
Thank you.
So first, I would like to start asking by your struggles you've experienced during your studies before you explored complexity, complex dynamic systems framework to study empathy. Did you do any quantitative analysis?
Yeah.
What were the other approaches you have?
Sure. So I've used the interpersonal reactivity index, that survey I talked about at the beginning. It is still prominent. Has been readapted in many different spaces and is still used today. In fact, there is an adapted version for teachers specifically. It's been rewritten, and um, my feeling is that it doesn't really give us everything. And of course, as we know, survey material neglects context, uses aggregate experiences. So instead of looking at one specific situated moment and one role, it's often having a person reflect on the entirety of their experiences, which also only gives us a glimpse into what's going on because they're pulling from potentially only a handful of experiences that are most salient to them. The approaches that I'm encouraging, of course, are more situated in the moment with people and in their experiences. And the other things I've seen with regard to empathy research is when you look at other survey material, we do see a lot more visual pieces. There's a lot of different ways in which people have used affective and cognitive empathy survey material to try and capture different people and groups' perceptions. And then also there is some people who've looked at or tried to look at observation data, which I think is also a bit complicated because empathy is such an internal experience. Even though there is a relational component, it can be quite difficult. So that's why I have shifted in my understanding of empathy to suggest that complexity really is the only way that makes sense to me, at least, when trying to understand how to really capture the social phenomenon when I really do care about it meaningfully. And instead of trying to say, well, this one very specific component and neglecting everything else, that's the thing that matters the most. And I just don't believe that's true anymore or ever, really.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
May I ask something? Well,
Please.
Joey, thank you very much. That is a very comprehensive and well thought out presentation, and you made it very clear. Thank you so much for that. And I can certainly see where complex dynamic systems applies and enriches our understanding of empathy. I wish you would use empathic instead of empathetic, but I'm losing that. I'm losing that battle, just a linguistic anomaly. My question has to do with Kelly. You said, and it was a wonderful question, that she would speak to the parents, I believe you said, of the children that she was teaching to ask what they would suggest she know about their child. What a wonderful question. But you also said that not everybody had an answer for that. I believe that you said that not all parents answered the question. Did I miss that? You're looking puzzled.
I don't recall saying that. She did not mention that. What she does at the beginning of the year is she speaks with parents, gathers information in multiple modes. So, for example, she sends out a survey. When she meets with parents at the beginning of the year, for example, back to school nights, she talks to all the parents. To kind of give some backstory to Kelly, Kelly, when she was a younger teacher, made an assumption about a student and his lived experiences that were so foreign to her own that she was appalled with herself. And that very emotional experience led to a processing and changing of her identity in the form of what was appropriate and what can I do. So she had a student who was sleeping on her class, and she kept saying, "Why do you sleep? Like, this is so inappropriate." And then one day the student and the guidance counselor were talking, and it was saying, you know, my father's out of the picture. I work 3 jobs at night. I come to school immediately after a night shift, and I'm tired. And that was not something she ever experienced. She did not experience that type of challenge or hardship in her life. So that type of assuming about people prevented her from in the future making assumptions about students. She often came to them with a bit of empathy in the way of hoping that they will respond to her, but she's not going to change her actions, unlike her foil of Kevin, who is just making many assumptions.
Mhm.
Also, by the way, I would love to talk to you after the fact about the empathetic. I will. As Avi smiles, that was a question that we also had, and I don't have a good answer for it, so happily to entertain
I'd be
that.
happy to talk with you about it, but can I come
Happily.
back to my question? So I'm going to be giving a talk myself next month at a state conference, and it has to do with identity.
Mm,
And so I was going along saying, we need to know about the identity of our students, especially with the marginalized population. And I listed all of these marginalized populations that we need to be aware of and be sensitive to. And I believe that. But it also has been pointed out to me that not everybody identifies. Just because I call them neurodivergent or whatever, doesn't mean necessarily that they are comfortable with that appellation, right? With that
mhm,
with that label. Um, and that's sort of thrown this whole thing in my mind. So what you just said now was really important. The idea of being a detective rather than a judge
mhm,
um, seems really important when I'm talking to teachers. Um, I mean, the point of being a judge, I suppose, is to help ease the burden of marginalized populations. That's what one's doing, but may misfire, may not connect with the actual feelings of the intended audience. There was just something on PBS the other night, the news hour, and I don't know how many people watch it or heard this part, but they were talking about a segment of the Latinx population called No Sabo. Did anybody hear that? No Sabo business? And No Sabo is a label that's used for Latinx people in this country who don't speak Spanish.
mhm,
And they resent the fact that they are, and they feel ashamed of the fact that they don't speak Spanish. And yet there's a large segment of them that are second or third generation immigrants to this country, right? But because of their culture, because of their appearance, because of their names, it's assumed that they speak Spanish. And there's a great example, I think, where you can say, let's not make assumptions about it. Let's not, and not necessarily make accommodations if they're not warranted.
mhm.
I mean, I don't know how you go about discerning that. I mean, you can ask them, which is what you did the parents. I guess there's a way to ask
I
older learners. Do you have a suggestion on that?
So I have a few actually, and it's very apropos to Kelly once again. So Kelly does have an experience where she is struggling to communicate with some of her students. Kelly is not a Spanish speaker, but Kelly has many Spanish speaking students and has found ways to almost as an inverse have her students empathize with her,
Hmm.
where she really starts to introduce her vulnerability with her students, and she encourages them to realize, like, I'm trying, we should try together. And it's a very warm space, so she has cultivated that. I don't think that's a simple, I can just do it and it happens. She has cultivated that over some time, but she does try and be playful with them in that way and acknowledge, I know you're struggling, I'm struggling too. There are also many people who will talk about how do teachers try and learn about their students? So there is the detective, but what are the mechanisms or the actions a detective should take? The most common, of course, is perspective taking, which is just a general term for trying to learn about someone else. And there's many different forms of perspective taking. The common one that is most encouraged, especially by Dr. Cesare Warren out of Vanderbilt, is learning about your students, but not trying to step into their shoes. So this we refer to as imagined self versus imagine other perspective taking. Imagine self is where I put myself in someone's shoes. Imagine other is where I have to imagine them from kind of afar. It's an outside perspective. And the reason why he encourages people to not engage in that of imagine self is because we can never truly know our students' experiences. And it is incumbent upon us to keep awareness and try and be, where appropriate, equitable, culturally conscious, and be thoughtful of how we are doing these things, but by not making assumptions about the students. In one of his papers, he actually talks about how one teacher tries to use her marginalized identity. She's a white teacher who I think identifies as a lesbian. And she tries to use that identity to make meaning of her Black students' marginalized identity. And while there might be some continuity between marginalization as a general term, the experiences in America are very different. So there's a question of like, don't try and make assumptions about me. Ask me questions, learn about me. Let's do this together. And there is also, and I will say, there's a form of empathy that's called strategic empathy, where teachers are encouraged to bring in perspectives that may run counter to their own, that may run against their own, and which is often very difficult, but you're encouraged to also remain skeptical. But in that way, you're inviting lived experiences, culture, knowledge, emotions, and other experiences that often are absent from the classroom into the classroom. I'm not sure that answered all of your question, but I'm
Could you
hoping
just say a little more about that last one, please?
Yes, I'm happy to also give you the link to a paper about it.
Okay.
But the big thing here is that it's a strategic empathy is a very specific form of empathy where you're encouraged to invite perspectives that might feel you're not supposed to condone a perspective, but you shouldn't condemn it either. It's kind of like the big idea. That's not always true. Of course, there are times when it's appropriate, but that's like the big idea. Let me try and find the paper for you really quickly.
Thank you. I don't want to dominate the discussion. I can
Yes,
stand down.
Pedagogies of Strategic Empathy. There we go. That's
Thank you.
for everyone if you want to read it. Wonderful piece.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question,
Please.
and this is for Joy and Avi. In your work, you went really deep. Were there any things that suggested any future work toward any modifications of DSMRI?
I'm going to say no. I'm going to turn to Avi though and see if you have any perspective on that.
This specific work has not challenged anything in the DSMRI. It's been informative. I mean, it has contributed to the development of the DSMRI because the role of emotions more generally in the DSMRI is something that we're still exploring. The emotion itself as a dynamic system and how it manifests emotion as with all its multifaceted components. How does it look in the DSMRI? So in that sense, yes. It hasn't challenged, but we all realize that the DSMRI is a model in progress. I mean, once it stopped progressing, we can probably throw it away. But as we continue to progress it, so Joey's dissertation research has brought emotion most explicitly so far into the DSMRI. But the other things that we're learning, and this is where the DSMRI is continuing to develop, is how it is manifesting the social cultural dynamics as a control parameter or a set of control parameters within which it is emerging and contributing in turn to the change in the environment as well.
I want to add one more thing where I think I found a novel use of the DSMRI that I never thought of before, and this work really inspired it, which is taking a literature and embedding it into the DSMRI has been very useful. The DSMRI in that way is becoming the framework, but I can use other constructs. So you, as you saw from this work, really you only saw a snapshot. But I was able to take existing empathy constructs and embed them inside the DSMRI in a way that felt meaningful to the authentic experience and the teacher's identity, their motivations, emotions, goals, etc. But I also have been developing, Avi, we should have a conversation about emotion regulation, because I also know that the emotion regulation has goals, has actions, has beliefs, and self-perceptions. Emotional awareness, emotion regulation by definition are goal states. For example, is something called hedonic versus instrumental goals. We have beliefs about emotion regulation, and then there are emotion regulation techniques that are the action possibilities. So what I found really fascinating is many of the literatures that we use fit inside the DSMRI, especially if you're interested in the role components and the person's motivation, actions, decisions, etc.
And I'll just add on what Joey said. So the DSMRI is a meta-theoretical framework. And in that, it provides the frame for theories to both be incorporated, but also to inform local theories of phenomena within that frame. So I think in that sense, it's flexible in the way that Joey was describing. But another comment just to Diane, so your imminent presentation about identity and how in students' identities and how the teachers relate to students' identity, perhaps the DSMRI can be helpful there as well, because what the DSMRI emphasizes is that identity is not the nominal categorization and even not the intersectional interaction of various nominal categorizations, but it's how the student constructs their own meaning of who they are in the contextual role they occupy. And more generally, the identity system is comprising the multiple roles they have in life. So developing an empathy and being empathic towards a student is not about it's not like being the judge and making assumptions about them because of their intersectional social group memberships, but rather it's trying to understand how do they construct who they are as a student. And then the DSMRI could provide helpful language to think, how do these students construct understanding of their reality? What are their purpose and goals? What are their self-perceptual self-definitions rather than the external imposition of those? And what do they perceive as available actions for them in that context in light of how they define themselves, the goals they pursue, and the construction of reality? And particularly, to me at least, being empathic towards such a person is to understand what their dilemmas, where are the tensions in their role identities, where do they feel negative emotions and that maybe they don't fit or they don't know exactly what to do. So I thought that might be helpful.
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
I just put the DSMRI paper in the chat for you. So if in case you want to look at it and go in a little more detail there.
Yeah, I think you should be giving the paper next month, though, not I.
Kind of building off of what Joey said and what Dr. Kaplan has said, I'm really interested in kind of understanding empathy and, like Joey was talking about, emotional regulation in collaborative group settings. What do you think is the potential for these models, especially how you depicted them, to show reciprocal relationships of empathy between students, teachers, peers, all in the same model? I think this has a really great applicability to, like I said, not just empathy, but regulation and socially regulated emotions or socially regulated empathy, or like you were talking about at the beginning, like emotional contagion. What do you think about depicting all of those things using these brilliant models that you have shown us today?
Can I just have a simple answer of yes?
That works, yeah.
Thank you. So I can tell you that there are ways in which people have depicted. Avi has depicted the interaction of different groups. So you can look at a group role identity. It's not only just the individuals. Or at the group level, how does that change? Of course, because we're using complexity approaches, what you do at the group level will look different from what you do at the individual level. My research is often just, I'm fascinated by teachers. I think that helping my goals, personal goals, are in relation to helping teachers teach better. And this is the way that I think I can help them, is in this form. I think there are people who are more interested in, as to your point, the relational aspect of it. And there are, I've been working on some of the conceptualizations behind what does it mean when I start to develop another person's identity through that empathic experience, or empathetic experience, whatever word you want to use. And I do believe that you can then capture where does something like emotional contagion, and for those who aren't familiar, emotional contagion is the description of when something like one emotion kind of is infectious around a group. So, for example, I smile and you all smile would be an example of that. Or I start crying and you all start crying. And I do believe that that's also quite easy, because it would then highlight the contextual and relational nature of the empathic experience that is at the heart of what is the work. It's just that I, as a researcher, have drawn my boundaries around the teacher specifically. And in fact, a critique of my work has, and is appropriately so, this does not include the perception of the students in the classroom, right? I'm only looking at the teacher's perceptions of their empathy. I haven't included the students. And I will say, those who are interested, there's this new work coming out by Jeff Foman at Tennessee and his advisor, Dr. Miller at George Mason, where they have been looking at how do we examine teacher empathy, but by the students' perceptions of their teacher's empathy. I will say, though, in my own critiques, though, it is a survey. So it still it has the same follies that a survey has. So I think, honestly, maybe, Molly, to your point, Jeff and I should talk. You should join us. And then maybe we could find a cool way of taking Jeff's ideas, but then putting them inside the DSM-RI, making them fit. Although I will say, Avi, I would like to hear if you have any thoughts on that as well, because I feel like that might be where I've seen some of the work, especially museums, also moving.
If you have sharing privileges, if you want to actually show, there's a diagram in the article you shared, where we take, I mean, because it's we work from the complex dynamic system, it's a hierarchical system, and as Joey said, his research forms an artificial boundary around the role identity of a teacher and their emergence of their role identity and empathic elements for that role identity. But you can then zoom out and have the focus be on an interaction between teachers, students, or team members working together and trying, and then each role identity emerges in relation and through feedback loops with the others, with whom they're interacting, and we try to capture this with this image in the article.
Let me pull it up right now. Sorry, my computer was acting up a little bit. Okay. I'm not sure why. I'm trying to show you. There we go. So the example that I was talking about is, you can see the individual A, individual B, individual C with inside of, and that's once again framed by their context, their domain, their culture, and their dispositions. And also a key feature is you can see that there are multiple DSM-RIs inside of the DSM-RIs, highlighting the nested nature and also the permeability between identities. Your teacher identity can bleed over, have influence with your parent identity, and that's kind of what you're seeing here. And I think, Molly, to your point, this is one of the unique features. Once again, I just drew my boundary at a very specific point.
Yeah, that nestedness is really interesting. Thanks for sharing. I'll have to explore it further and talk to you and Jeff some more.
Oh, we'll have to hit up at ARA and we'll make it work.
Yeah, we are coming to the end of our presentation. Joey, thank you so much for this rich presentation and wonderful discussion. Hold on. I'm sorry, this is my first experience hosting these presentations. So we are looking forward to seeing you in our upcoming webinar next month. We will soon send out the details and registration link. Please stay tuned for the updates on our communication channels. I hope I can share the communication channels with you right now. Thank you so much again, and I hope you all have a good night.
Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you, Hyundai, for the invitation.
Thank you.
It's great to be home.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Joey, and everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Avi, also for your both
Thank
part
you.
a lot of this and also for the comments.
Very good, Joey. Thank you very much.
Okay.